You're listening to the Music Educator podcast with your host, Bill Stevens, the 21st century music educator man.
Podcasting from beautiful Leesburg, Virginia. Welcome to the Music Educator podcast, bringing you the latest tips, tricks, and practical advice you can use tomorrow. Here's your host and fellow music educator, Bill Stevens.
Hello and welcome one and all to the Music Educator Podcast. My name is Bill Stevens and I will be your host for today. It's a beautiful fall day today, and today in Season 4, Episode 37, we're going to learn a little bit about MIDI. Let's do this. In today's episode, we're going to talk about MIDI, and I need to provide credit to the book from Alfred. It's called Music Tech 101 by Brian Laxo, and hopefully I have said his name correctly. It is a wonderful book. It's very complete. It's endorsed by the Technology for Music Education organization, and it also includes correlating media to stream or download. So if you find some of the material that's in today's podcast interesting, check out the book. It's really worth the time and money you invest into it. Now, for those of you that don't really know me yet, I am a middle school band director, but I also teach some guitar and some music technology. And in middle school, it has less defined standards than perhaps the high school level. But that also gives us a little bit of freedom to work with students that may not have a lot of musical experience. And when I hear the word MIDI, at least before I started teaching, often I would think of one of two things. One would be a type of WAV file that I could export from either Finale, Sibelius, NoFly, one of those programs. Or it was a type of cable that certain older school keyboards might have, or, different kinds of devices. So that kind of got me thinking, you know what? We really need to know about this kind of stuff. Is it hardware? Is it software? Let's find out. So let's get started. And first and foremost, MIDI. So this is MIDI, often in capital letters, and it stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. So now back up to the late 1970s, early 80s, when you had all these new musical electronic devices that started coming out. You had your drum machines, you had different kinds of sequencers. However, you lacked a common way to interconnect these musical devices. And obviously, with these musical devices, people want to perform with them. Well, it wasn't really until MIDI came around where this problem was solved. And that's where we're taking MIDI first, is this interconnectivity. Now let's talk about the whole MIDI communication. So this concept of MIDI was taken on by different representatives, different manufacturing representatives. And this was like the early 1980s, so say 1983. And what happened was these manufacturers developed a type of connection, or part of a cord with a connection, that had a 5-pin DIN, D-I-N. And this kind of serves as what we would consider like a modern day USB. The aspect that was unique to it, it was specifically designed for musical instruments. So this MIDI cord, or this MIDI connection, would connect all kinds of things. Keyboards, like synthesizers, like different kinds of drum machines. It connected what was already out and served as a universal communication, so all the instruments would be lined up as they would perform. Okay, so these MIDI instruments, they communicated with each other. And you had keyboards and drum machines, samplers, pad controllers, digital drum pads, and wind controllers. And that's only a fraction of what the MIDI could interconnect with. And what you need to understand is that not all MIDI instruments actually created sounds. What they did was they would trigger other instruments with different sampling of sounds. So you had a keyboard that you could make sound like a flute or a brass section or something different. By doing that, you could get a huge number of just completely off the wall sounds to perform at the same time with one controller. Now, MIDI also developed a sense of compactness and made things easier for the performer. Now that you had MIDI, you didn't have to have multiple keyboards all over the place just to get different sounds. Now you could use a MIDI controller to control these little boxes that were small enough to be in a suitcase, and you can use just one controller. And as you see, as computers also came into the picture, things became smaller and smaller, and you could do more and more. So let's talk about the basic functionality of the MIDI. So in MIDI, there are three basic ports. The cable can be constructed to go in the in, out, or through port. Okay. So a musician takes an instrument, and they're going to call this the master instrument, and it's going to connect the out port of the master. Okay, so you're going to put the MIDI cable into the out portion of the master instrument, whatever that is. That's where the musician is controlling everything. Okay, and it's going to serve and go into the import of what they call the slave instrument. Wish there was a better word for it, but that's what it's called. And with that kind of setup, the master controller directly use the master instrument to control sounds and or use the functions of the slave MIDI instrument. Now you can also connect several different instruments together using the through ports, and this is called daisy chaining. And I'm going to use the Music Tech 101 book to give you an example. So, for example, a piano sound coming from a master Yamaha keyboard could trigger flute and string sounds coming from two slave chord keyboards, all three playing simultaneously, which would create a rich, layered sound. So this is coming directly from the book. And again, quote, Music Tech 101. In addition, MIDI can hold a whole bunch of information because it carries different information about velocity, volume, instrument, pitch, pedaling, all kinds of things. And the MIDI signals are given a value between the scale of 0 and 127. And as a result, the maximum number of instrument sounds it can handle are 128. And that last signal is the MIDI time code, or what we call the MTC. And this is what helps keep everything in alignment when you're connecting multiple instruments. MIDI can also be used for not specific to music uses because it carries so much information. And during the 1980s, when computers started exploding, we were able to take things that would have taken a lot more hardware and put them together in a computer-based software in which MIDI would connect. And often we call this the MIDI interface. And you can see this often used when you're dealing with DAWs, digital audio workstations. This was a great way to pass along great amounts of information to non-musical devices. With the advancement of computers, MIDI could now help these computers record in musical layers, and not only could classically music composers create music on computers with MIDI, and non-musically trained individuals could create music with visual blocks of sound. On the other end, music notation software that had formal music notation could now use keyboards, electronic keyboards, to input music with relatively good accuracy. And finally, MIDI also provides the tools needed to control and program theater stage lighting. And they actually call this stage lighting control MIDI show control. And you might see an example of this at Disney with the Pirates of the Caribbean and any of those animatronic moves that coincide with music. And even more, you also have the popular video games such as Guitar Hero, Rock Band, and DJ Hero that run on MIDI that help determines the correct notes, whether they've been played by the user or not. That is all the time we have for today. I want to thank you again for joining me for another episode of the Music Educator Podcast. It is a true pleasure to share this craft with lovers of music and educators like you. If you found value in today's episode, please feel free to leave a review and rate us on the Music Educator Podcast app, Apple Podcasts, or any other podcast aggregator. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you join us next time. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Music Educator Podcast. For the latest tips, tricks, and practical advice you can use tomorrow. You can subscribe to our podcast on every podcast aggregator or download the Music Educator app for free in the Apple or Google Play app stores. Furthermore, visit our blog at www.bandbuzz.org for additional music education resources. We will see you on the next episode of the Music Educator Podcast. And remember, music can change the world.
Hey everyone, this is Bill Stevens with the Music Educator Podcast. See this episode's show notes for a unique promo code from the Music Educator Podcast to get up to 2 months of free podcasting service with Libsyn. Get your show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify anywhere you want. Get critical stats to help you grow. Find all the tools and support you need to sound your very best. You can even do video. Really, bring your podcast to life with Libsyn. See show notes for our unique Libsyn promo code and get podcasting.